So we have this moment between Joseph and his brothers where he forgives them, where they are sorry for what they've done. We have both forgiveness offered and reconciliation. So much had happened before that this moment is so beautiful. But it's also powerful for what happens after this moment. Because Joseph reconciled with his brothers and maintained a relationship with them and allowed them to continue to live in Egypt with him, he had a relationship of trust and love that grew with his brothers that then led to something powerful. You see, his brother Judah ended up being the great grandfather to David, who became King David. And King David became great, a lot of greats, grandfather to someone you may have heard of named Jesus. So in this long family tree that goes from Joseph and leads through Judah and all the way to David and then to Jesus, forgiveness becomes a powerful thread. It shows that in this family, that forgiveness marks this family more powerfully than any of their failures. Forgiveness is a powerful theme in the story of Joseph, and that starts in Genesis at the beginning of our scripture and goes all the way through Jesus, and that thread of forgiveness reaches even into our lives and is offered to us. In preparation for this preaching series on forgiveness, I've been reading a book with a really clever title. It's called Forgiveness. It's a good book. And it's actually one that I wanted to really read deeply through because I wanted to see if it would be a good small group study for us in the future. And as I've been reading through this book in the past month, there was a line that stopped me dead in my tracks. I read this: forgiveness isn't optional. Now, how does that sit with you all? Hearing forgiveness isn't optional. I have a feeling there's people who think, no, wait, sometimes forgiveness isn't possible. It's impossible. I've talked to a lot of people who have said things like, I will never forgive that person for what they have done to me. And often behind that sentence is a story of deep hurt, of deep wounds, of something that has been taken from someone that can never be given back. When someone says, I will never forgive this person, it's often because something like time has been robbed from them. Maybe it's the years invested in a marriage that has been thrown away. Maybe it is robbing of a dream that cannot be replaced, that cannot be given back. Maybe someone's honor and dignity has been taken away and cannot be fully restored. I've been reading a lot of these stories of #MeToo, of women who have been victimized by powerful men who have had their dignity and honor taken from them. Sometimes a life has been taken from you. How can you repay a life that has been taken? Forgiveness sometimes just seems so impossible, especially if the person who has wronged you isn't even sorry about it, is not repentant for what they've done. Sometimes forgiveness just feels impossible. But I think what this is trying to communicate when it says forgiveness isn't optional, it doesn't mean that forgiveness is easy. And it doesn't mean that forgiveness is instant. And it doesn't mean that it even changes the heart of the person who offended you. These are 4 things up here that I want to share that forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not excusing a wrong. It's not saying, what you did to me is just fine. It is not saying that. Forgiveness does not always lead to reconciliation. Forgiveness is about one person offering forgiveness to another person. Reconciliation is when the other person reciprocates and you work on a plan of reconciliation together. That doesn't always happen. It's not always possible. Forgiveness does not mean that someone does not have to suffer the consequences of their sin. Sometimes there are legal repercussions There is time to be served. There are other things that need to be paid back. Forgiveness is not about the offender. I think that's the thing that is most important. Forgiveness is not about the offender, it's about the person who offers forgiveness. I've noticed in our teaching series, we've been making sure to say what forgiveness is not. But I also want to say what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is an invitation to new life. Forgiveness is an opportunity to experience healing. Forgiveness is a way to get out of the spiritual hell of rage and anger and vengeance and hatred and bitterness and grudges. Forgiveness is giving those things to God so that God can start healing your heart, so that God can start giving you that new life, that wholeness, and that connection that you need to God and others. That's what forgiveness is. But there are a lot of situations in this world where forgiveness just seems almost impossible. I want to talk to you about a situation where I heard about forgiveness offered in such a beautiful way, in such a tragic circumstance, and it's hard for us to talk about. I've been thinking about this story for the last number of weeks, even before what happened in a Texas church just 10 days ago. There was another church shooting in 2015, in June, and it took place in a church in South Carolina where a man entered the church and there was a Bible study going on, and the members of the Bible study welcomed him to join with them, and they engaged in conversation with him, and then at the end of this Bible study, right as they started to pray, he got up and he started to shoot them. He killed 9 people in that Bible study, and the reason he killed them is because they were black. He said, "I'm sorry, I have to shoot you." And he wasn't even sorry about it. Afterwards, he said he almost chickened out because they were so kind to him. But he said he needed to do it because they don't deserve to live. Now that is just a painful, horrible thing for us to think about. But when the family members of the victims had an opportunity to come face to face with this man in his first court hearing, each of these family members offered a statement of forgiveness. That's the thing that just seems so impossible to me, that they all gave statements of forgiveness. One of the daughters of the women, one of the women who was killed said this: "You took something really precious from me. I will never talk to her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul. You hurt me. You hurt a lot of people, but God forgives you. I forgive you." What a powerful statement. I want you to notice that she's not excusing what he did. She's not saying it's okay. She's not saying he shouldn't suffer the consequences that were coming to him. He did get a sentence of the death penalty. But she is saying, it hurt me, it impacted me. On the back of your bulletins, I actually have step by step how to ask for forgiveness and how to offer forgiveness. And part of being able to offer forgiveness is also to say the ways that you were hurt, the ways that you were impacted. Now, all of these family members offered a powerful witness to all of us in what it looks like to start the process of forgiving. The pastor of that church in South Carolina was also murdered on that night. And so the new pastor who has come into that community says this. His name is Eric Manning. "We are a community aspiring to forgive," because he acknowledges that within this church, people are at all different places along this path of forgiveness, but the goal is forgiveness. And he wants people to be able to explore what they need to explore as they're moving towards forgiveness. But he says they do not want to be a community that ends up being built on bitterness, that's built on hatred and rage and division and fear. They want to continue to be a community that is based in God's love, a community that witnesses to the power of forgiveness. And so they call themselves a community aspiring to forgive. I wonder why it is so hard to hear that forgiveness isn't optional. And I think as I've wrestled with this book, the reason it seems so hard to me is because I think it's absolutely true. Forgiveness isn't optional. Jesus said, "Forgive others as God has already forgiven you." Jesus gives this command not to give us a burden, but it says Jesus' command frees us from the emotional torment that would otherwise bind us to our offenders forever because of their inability to pay their debts to us. Maybe that's why Joseph chose to forgive his brothers in that scene that I shared with you from Genesis. They could never replace the years that they took from him. They stole from him his adolescence. They stole from him his early adulthood. He spent time in prison in Egypt. He struggled through many things that those years will never be given back to him, and the things he experienced while he was a slave, while he was in prison. But throughout that time, then he also had that gift of interpreting dreams, and he was elevated to a powerful position with the Pharaoh because he had a useful skill. And in the end, his family ended up coming to Egypt asking for help, and Joseph was in a position to help them, and he did. But then his brothers thought, what if he's just helping because our father is here and he loves his father so much? So when his father dies, Joseph is in a real position of power. He almost is like God over them. He has the power to exact revenge. He can expel them from Egypt, take away all their money, their livelihood, and send them on their way with nothing. And instead, he chooses forgiveness. He chooses that path of healing that can restore the relationship rather than revenge. But it must have seemed impossible to him. Maybe it still seems impossible sometimes to those folks in South Carolina and to other people who have been impacted by senseless murder. How to forgive. Maybe it can almost seem like dying when you're letting go of that grudge, of that anger. But if you're wondering what does that feel like, just ask Jesus, the person who actually did spread out his arms and choose to die for us. Because that kind of death leads to resurrection. By allowing the bitterness, the hatred, the anger to die, to be given up to God, something new can be birthed. New life can come from that situation. I think that's what Joseph was choosing. And then much, much later on, his descendant, Jesus, would choose to forgive the whole world. We have that thread of forgiveness that reaches all the way to us, and we're asked to extend it to others. But some of you might be thinking, I don't know how to get there. Take a baby step. Maybe just start in your prayers to ask God to soften your heart. Try to give some of that anger and that bitterness to God, and just try to keep giving it to God in your prayers and see what God can work in your hearts. But start with a baby step, even if forgiveness seems impossible. Just know this, Jesus has already offered forgiveness to you. And that's a gift that none of us deserve, but he gave it anyway. Amen.